Every year, the National Hockey League, the NHL, pauses in the middle of its season to celebrate its very best players. The All-Star Game has long been a fan favorite, a wonderful opportunity for the fans to celebrate players that they love. And this year, the 2015-16 season, the NHL really needed a good, brand-boosting All-Star Game in the middle of what many would call a rather lackluster, uninspiring season. That's not what they got. What they got instead were a series of rather embarrassing mistakes. Now I realize that though we are all Canadians here, that doesn't necessarily mean we're all hockey fans. Maybe not everyone followed this. And I'm sure you're probably wondering what on earth an All-Star Game might possibly have to do with the gospel truth, but I hope you will stick with me here for a little bit, because you might find that truth before we're done. Anyways, the NHL was moving towards its All-Star Games, its All-Star Game this January, when they made their first mistake. The first mistake was to include the fans in voting for the members of the All-Star team. Now that mistake was not actually a new mistake in 2016. It was a mistake that was first made way back in 1985. Ever since 1985, the NHL has given the fans a voice in choosing the All-Star teams. But, as we all know, a whole lot has changed in the world since 1985. And one particular thing that has changed in the world since that time is that the fans are now connected to one another through social media in ways that could never have been dreamed of before. So somebody, nobody's quite sure who, decided to leverage social media this year and started a campaign to try and convince people to vote for one particular player to be on the All-Star team. And so the campaign was started, a Twitter campaign especially, with the hashtag Vote John Scott. They wanted people to vote John Scott onto the team. Now I don't know why someone came up with this idea, where it came from. But for some reason, fans everywhere latched on to this particular campaign and did it as a way to get back at the league for all kinds of personal reasons. Because you see, this John Scott that they were trying to vote on to the All-Star team was someone who, by any measure, did not belong among the All-Stars. In fact, a lot of people said that John Scott did not even belong in the NHL. He's been playing this season for the Arizona Coyotes, and he's actually spent as much time in the minor AHL league as he has in the NHL. So this season, he had only played 11 games, he had scored 0 goals, chalked up 1 assist, and spent almost half an hour sitting in the penalty box. He was an enforcer, a big bruiser, and a lot of people said he hardly represented, by any measure, the best of the game of hockey. Nevertheless, the fans kept on voted on him so much that he came in far ahead of some of the greatest players in the league. And finally, the fans bestowed on John Scott the honor of being the captain of the Pacific team for the All-Star game. Pretty clearly, the NHL had made a big mistake by giving the fans this opening to use their voting to mess with the league and get in the way of their goal of having a brand-boosting All-Star game. So it was a mistake. And maybe it wouldn't have been a big deal. Maybe nobody would have cared all that much if the NHL had just left it there. But the NHL did not. The NHL began to pull out all of the stops to make sure that John Scott would not play in that All-Star team. They tried to persuade him to bow out. That did not work. They then tried to bribe him. When that didn't work, they actually tried to shame him into not playing. They told him that his own children would be ashamed of him if he showed up for the All-Star game. When that didn't work, that's when the league started to get mean. Now, you can't quite prove this. It's merely allegations. A lot of people blame the commissioner, Gary Bettman, but it could have been anyone else. But the league began to really mistreat John Scott. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, quite unexpectedly, he was traded. In the middle of winter, he was traded from Phoenix and sent to Montreal, the Canadiens. No sooner had he arrived in Montreal than the Canadiens demoted him and sent him down to their farm team in the AHL, which is the St. John's Ice Caps. The argument was, since John Scott no longer played for the Coyotes, since he no longer actually even played in the NHL, well, there was no way he could possibly play in the NHL All-Star game. So this guy, all of a sudden, in the middle of winter, gets sent for no discernible reason from sunny, warm Arizona to deepest, darkest Newfoundland. Him and his family. It looked to a lot of people as if John Scott was being punished. But John Scott, let's be clear here, had done nothing wrong. He is, in fact, by all accounts, a really nice guy. A guy who just happens to love the game of hockey, loves to play. A guy who loves his kids, and is only dangerous if you happen to meet him on the ice. And John Scott had made no mistakes. The only one who had made any mistakes, if there were any mistakes, was the NHL. And it looked to everybody as if John Scott and his family were going to be the only ones who would pay for the league's mistake. But isn't that just the way things always go? Right? It's the same old story that is old as human society itself. Certainly as old as the Bible, as old as the book of Isaiah. In the book of Isaiah, there are a series of songs or poems that are often called the Songs of the Suffering Servant. These songs can be found in Isaiah 42, 49, 50, and 53. this morning from the Bible. They tell the story of a man who is chosen by God, who is called by God to do good in this world and to do no evil, and who, despite that, is relentlessly mistreated and persecuted for the good that he does. And so the treatment of this suffering servant is described in this way, as we read this morning. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Now, when these words were first written, the man who wrote them, the prophet, was no doubt thinking of some particular person who he identifies simply as this servant of the Lord. He was probably thinking of someone from his own time and from his own nation, whom he had seen God take and use to do great things, good things in the world, and who had done nothing wrong, and who was nevertheless mistreated because of it. In fact, he may even have been thinking of himself, talking about himself as a roundabout way, and complaining about how he himself, though called and commissioned by God to be a prophet and to do good, had been rejected and abused. So he probably had some particular person in mind, either himself or someone else. And yet at the same time, there is something universal about the story of this suffering servant, because it is a story that has been played out again and again and again throughout history. And that is why Christians, in particular, have looked at these stories, these songs of the suffering servant in the book of Isaiah, and seen in them a description of the suffering and the death of Jesus of Nazareth. And rightly so. It is true indeed that in Jesus, in his suffering, in his death, we have a reflection of these ancient songs of the suffering servant. In fact, I would even go even further than that. For I would say that we have in Jesus the definitive example of what it is to live out the story of the suffering servant. Jesus exemplifies this figure far better than anyone else, far more than any other figure in history. And since the suffering and the death of Jesus is an eternal event, it is an event that, though it took place at one moment in time, has an eternal effect over all of history. I would even go so far as to say that these songs of the suffering servant in Isaiah are actually based on the story of the suffering and death of Jesus, even though they were written so many centuries before the time of Christ. That's one thing that it means to call these songs books of prophecy. So Jesus is very clearly the supreme example, the ultimate example of the suffering servant who does good and is mistreated for it. But he is not the only example. For this story has played out again and again and again throughout history. And that's actually why I wanted to tell you the story this morning of John Scott and the All-Star Game. Because I see in that story an echo. And absolutely it's a very dim and distant echo But it is an echo nonetheless of the song of the suffering servant. John Scott's story follows that same pattern that has been played out over and over and over again through history. And of course, I do not mean to suggest by that what John Scott suffered through measures up in any way whatsoever to what Jesus suffered. Of course not. There's no comparison. There's no comparison between what John Scott suffered and what Isaiah's suffering servant suffered. I'm just saying that all of these stories just seem to follow the same pattern. It just keeps on happening. And the pattern is this: the powers and the authorities of this world, whether they be kings or princes or priests or commissioners or sports leagues, whatever those authorities be, they have their plans. And their plans are basically for themselves to prosper, and that they never should have to pay for any of their mistakes. That's for other people to do. That's for the little people to do. They're the ones who get to pay for their mistakes. That's what the John Scotts are for. And the Jesuses of Nazareth. And the suffering servants. It is the pattern of this world. To give you just another rather egregious example from current events, let's talk for a moment about another mistake. The officials in the state of Michigan, we've all heard about this, made some really serious mistakes which led to switching the city of Flint over in its water supply from depending on Lake Michigan, or Lake Huron, I think it is, to the Flint River, which was deeply polluted. It was a change that was made in order to save a little bit of money. And it was a disastrous mistake. Who pays for that mistake? Will it be the city officials? Probably not. Not in any significant way. It will not be the state officials. The people who will pay the price for that mistake, as usual, will be the citizens of Flint. The ordinary people who, for generations, may be dealing with the effects of lead poisoning. That's how it happens in our world. But the wonderful thing about the story of the suffering servant is that that is not the end of the story. The story does not end with John Scott finishing his career playing for the AHL with the St. John's Ice Caps. The story does not end with Jesus dying on the cross. The story turns and takes us in a very interesting direction. Let me just quickly tell you how the story of John Scott and the game ended. The fans, you see, did not buy the league's excuses that John Scott could not play in the All-Star game. We don't care, they said. Let him play. Another social media campaign was started up with the hashtag #FreeJohnScott. And the message became so loud and so insistent that the league ultimately had no choice. And the invitation was extended for John Scott to go to Nashville and play in the All-Star game. So he went. And he played. And much to the surprise of everyone, John Scott had an amazing game. Probably the best game of his entire career. He just blew everybody away. And anyone who was there, anyone who was watching the game, could not help but see that John Scott had actually made that game worth watching. But despite that, the league would not let his name be entered into the balloting as the most valuable player in the game. Did the fans care? No, they did not. Right in the middle of the game, the fans started shouting, "John Scott, John Scott, John Scott," and MVP, MVP. And at the end of the night, even though his name was not on the ballot, John Scott swept the voting as a write-in candidate and was named Most Valuable Player. Which all led to a really kind of beautiful moment when Gary Bettman, the guy that most people blame for the entire debacle, had to stand at center ice and smile and pretend to be happy as he handed John Scott a check for $1 million. It's a great moment. That's how the story ends. But that beautiful moment is only, as I say, the dimmest reflection of the real victory that we are talking about and moving towards. That story is only important because it can remind us of a story of immense eternal importance. The story of another victim who ultimately overcame the powers of this dark world and triumphed over them. As the victim, the powers of this world thought that they had won, thought that they had put Jesus exactly where they wanted him. But Jesus turned the tables and won the victory, redeeming all. This is how the victory of the suffering servant is summed up in the book of Isaiah. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. The story is this: the victim suffers at the powers of this world, is apparently defeated, and in so doing brings redemption to the whole system. People have seen reflections of that in the story of John Scott as well. I've heard some sports commentators who made the prediction, in fact, that the high point of the entire 2015-16 NHL season, a season that has been kind of disappointing in lots of ways, may well prove to be the All-Star game. All because of John Scott. The guy who became the victim, who got banished to outer Newfoundland, may end up redeeming the entire season. How much more is it true that Jesus, the victim, banished to death, can redeem the whole world? It's a dim echo of the same ultimate truth. Because this is how God operates. The world has its way of operating. The world has its plans. The powers, the authorities of this world come up with their plans to prosper for themselves. Their plans for making sure that they themselves don't have to suffer for their mistakes, that others will do that. And they may seem to get away with it for a while, truth that we proclaim is that there is a God of justice who will not let that stand. But God has a particular way of doing that, of standing against the authorities of this world. God often does not confront them directly, because that kind of confrontation often doesn't help, sometimes makes things worse. And so God's method is this. He sides with the victims. And with a wonderful, marvelous sense of humor, God has this way of taking the victims and giving to them, even in their moment of defeat, the victory that redeems the whole thing. That's the story that we celebrate in Christ Jesus. That is the victory we get to celebrate in a couple of weeks. So I would say this. When the world gets you down, when the way that this world operates discourages you, and let me tell you, if the world doesn't discourage you from time to time, you're probably not paying attention. Hold this picture in your mind. If you want, you can hold a picture of John Stott holding his $1 million check at Center Ice. But a better picture is the picture of the ultimate victim. The one who was brought down low by the powers and authorities of this world, and in his moment of victimhood and defeat, exposed just how empty the powers and authorities of this world are. That is our victory. That is what we celebrate. Would you please take a few moments now in silent reflection?